One thing that has been striking to me is the willingness of Chinese companies to really jump into new industries, to make these bold bets. And in some cases, they're enticed by government incentives, government support. What should the approach be in the area of AI competition with China? What should U.S. policy be? Whether the U.S. should be restricting or increasing restrictions on chip exports to China?
What should the U.S.-China strategy be? Should it just be an attempt at containment suppression? Or should we try to imagine something new altogether?
Yeah, I think...
Today, I'm speaking to Kyle Chan. Kyle is a postdoctoral researcher at the Princeton University and an adjunct researcher at the RAND Corporation based in the US. His research focuses on industrial policy, clean technology, and infrastructure in China and India. He writes a popular newsletter called High Capacity, focusing on China's industrial policies, tech development, and US-China competition. In today's conversation, we cover the evolution of China's industrial policy, how it has managed to become the world's top innovator, and the lessons the US can learn from China. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. In economics, industrial policy figures very heavily as a field of discipline. But no one really thinks that a sociologist should study industrial policy. I think you're one of the first few people I know that actually do such a thing. Why?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question to start. So for me, actually, the main topic that I'm interested in is like even broader than industrial policy, arguably. It's development. And it's a topic that I think used to be more popular. I mean, still, you have like development economics. You have the subfield of sociology of development. But I feel like this topic has kind of like fallen a little bit into the background, at least in the West. And it's something that I think has come back because of industrial policy, because of actually, in particular, the rise of China and sort of dealing with China, things like that. So yeah, for me, the sociology offers a way to not just look at, like market structure, things like that, but to look at like these broader systems, like what is the role of like, government policy? What is the role of these different sort of actors, thinking about corporations as social actors, universities, research centers, things like that, how, as industry associations, sort of a much broader view than what is typically, you know, discussed in economics. So that's sort of where I'm coming at it from. I'm trying to bring in like all these different dimensions to the question of like development. What drives development? How can countries actively promote development?
In the economist toolkit, you think about, trade-offs, opportunity costs, demand supply, thinking at the margin. So these are kind of like some of the tools in their conceptual toolkits in which they try to understand natural phenomena. So naturally for you, I'd like for you to kind of help me understand, what are some of the toolkits that you use to kind of understand industrial policy as a mode to further development?
Some of it is like language that's shared across the social sciences. So a big one is really like spillover effects. And it's funny because now it's become a bigger topic in economics, but it's sort of like the bread and butter of sociology in a way, and other parts of the social sciences. This idea that like you have maybe a bilateral or a two-party deal or relationship, but it can have impacts on surrounding communities, on regions and cities, and even at the national level. So, so this is one area where I think for a long time economics was very focused, on how do the parties involved in any kind of transaction gain or split sort of like the gains from that relationship. But I think what's interesting about industrial policy is it's looking at what are the potential spillovers for broader national development. Like an example is infrastructure. So I had originally begun a lot of my research focused on transportation, high-speed rail development, like in China. And if you look at it in a narrow sense, you might look at a single railway line and be like, okay, what's the financial return back to investors? If you take into account, the capital costs, but then OpEx costs, but also the revenues from passenger fares, things like that. And you might come out with a positive or negative sort of cash flow or return on investment. But I think what's interesting is to see the broader spillovers that aren't captured by traditional economic models. How does that help all the different um, regional jurisdictions along that route? How does it help increase land prices or facilitate business and the flow of ideas between these different areas? And again, thinking all the way to the national level, like how does an entire national high-speed train system support, for example, like China's economic development? These things are, I think, are very hard to capture in like a traditional, narrower economic sense. So I think that part is what I try to bring back into the discussion.
If you run a business like me, you know how frustrating it gets to manage your money across multiple accounts and platforms. Now with Revolut Business, you can streamline everything into one business account that will handle all your business financial needs. Every month, over 20,000 new businesses join Revolut Business, and it's easy to see why. Whether you are a startup or scale up, Revolut Business is here to help you build your business better. Other than its beautifully designed card, here's what I really love about Revolut Business. With Revolut Business, I can handle over 25 different currencies at once in a single account. This means I get to store the transfers I receive in the same currency and exchange it only when I need to. I don't have to pay exchange fees during market hours within my money plan limits. And for a business that's operating out of Singapore but is truly global minded, that is a huge win for me. On top of that, what's amazing is that you can connect your accounting software like Xero directly into your Revolut Business account. This allows you to automate all your expense management and reconcile all your transactions. And for me, that's saying goodbye to a troublesome and nightmare-inducing accounting experience. From a basic plan to an enterprise level account, Revolut Business offers 4 different plans to match where you are at in your business journey. So if you are ready to control your business finances, you can sign up via this link, www.revolut.com/RB/TFR. Or you can visit the first link in my description to redeem your $50 welcome bonus. This offer is only available for new Revolut Business customers. Terms and conditions and end dates do apply. Once again, a big thank you to Revolut Business for sponsoring today's episode. On a micro level in Singapore, when we first wanted to adopt the MRT, the Mass Rapid Transport System in Singapore, there was a huge debate. Actually, we've got economists, scientists from Yale and Harvard to come out to do a study. And there was actually a televised public debate between the buses and MRT system. We eventually went with the MRT system, and a huge part of it was because the MRT system allowed you to avoid the pains of congestion. Whereas in bus, you're still stuck with congestion at the end of the day, right? Whereas in the MRT, you could build tunnels, you could build different systems around it to avoid the congestion problem. And that was fascinating because that wasn't actually something that was captured in the economic discussion of, say, a bus or a train system. Naturally, my follow-on for you would then be, what do you find in your study of China's high-speed rail project from your years of research?
My area of focus was sort of like how they built it, especially the sort of like government institutions, the role of state-owned enterprises that were involved. But overall, I think there's a lot of like really interesting findings about these broader spillover effects. Some of it is very creative, like you can look at land value capture along the way, and this is something that's a bit more unique to the Chinese system, given the sort of state control over land. That's different than a lot of other countries. But some of it actually kind of mirrors like what happened with Hong Kong's metro development, things like that, in terms of sort of capturing some of this extra economic spillover. So yeah, and one major area that I focused on was just trying to understand, like how did all these different agencies coordinate? Building a high-speed rail line, it's such a complex endeavor. It entails, not just engineers and sort of technical expertise, but you're dealing with land acquisition, you're dealing with population resettlement along the way, you're dealing with coordination across all the different local governments, some of which are actually, invested in China's case in the actual project itself. You're dealing with environmental reviews and permitting. There's a whole host of moving parts. And so it's actually a very complex, not just engineering challenge, but like a sort of socio-political challenge. So that's where my research focused. It was trying to understand, like what is the organizational structure that allowed for China to build high-speed rail so quickly, and especially I had done a lot of comparative work with India because India was also trying to build new railway lines, trying to expand, and actually they have their first bullet train line underway, built with help from Japan. But I found that in the Chinese system, one thing that was really important was having a few agencies be what I call nodal actors. That is, they don't just have like this top-down system. I mean, some of the planning is done obviously at the very top, but in terms of actually coordinating financing, coordinating land acquisition, coordinating, all the contractors along the way, a lot of that was done by these, uh, purpose purpose-made project corporations that are state-owned, but those are really crucial in sort of coordinating all this activity. So that to me was really interesting. It sort of like went against this idea that, oh, everything's sort of top down. Beijing, decides something and just sort of rolls it out. I think that old model has sort of shifted, and now I think there's a more sort of like, I wouldn't call it like fully decentralized, but sort of a more complex approach to doing these sorts of projects that I think actually turns out to be much more effective.
When I interviewed Prof. Ke Yu-jin, she did share that, if you think about the SOE's role in China, uh, traditionally the way it's been conceptualized is twofold, right? One is to prevent social unrest. So you kind of
Mm.
create a space for employment where maybe some people have not been appropriately skilled. They need they need a job essentially, right? So maybe the
Yeah.
American critique is that that's a bullshit job, right? But like for them, it's a way to prevent social unrest. And then the second element is something
Right.
we talked about earlier that figures very heavily, which is you're there to support national development. But
Mhm.
when these two are your primary objectives, then sometimes without a profit motive, a lot of kind of misaligned incentives happen and corruption happens, and then there's
Yeah.
a lot of maybe negative downstream effects. But we're not here today to talk about the SOEs. We're here to kind of focus our conversation on industrial policy. So I would like to first take us back to uh, this 2016 paper that you had a critique of, which was the China shock. Uh, and
Oh yeah.
I wanted to quote from your essay that you wrote about it. It was a very brief essay, but I think it's very incisive, which is that, in the papers, it asserts that it's estimated that the US lost nearly 1 million manufacturing jobs from 1999 to 2011 due to the surge of Chinese imports, starting around the time of China's accession to WTO in 2001.
The funny thing is the paper itself, I don't have critiques of. I think it's actually a very strong paper. It's actually a set of papers building on each other. Um, by really well-known economists like David Otter at MIT, Darren Asamoah. So the paper itself is trying to look at, or the set of papers are really focused on sort of like the concentrated geographical effects of the so-called China shock, of rising imports of Chinese goods in particular industries, like furniture is one example, and how areas in the US that were more exposed to those sorts of industries ended up having higher manufacturing job losses.
Mm.
So that part of the paper, I have no criticisms of. I think it's very sound methodology, and it's sort of the gold standard, that set of papers. But the problem is that this narrative got really sort of like blown out of proportion, and that's what I was
Mm.
trying to capture in that piece. That in fact. Um, over the longer horizon, if you look at the past, several decades, I mean, going, back to the post-World War II period in the U.S., you have a longer term trend separate from China of just declining manufacturing as a share of employment in the U.S. I mean, essentially, you have the United States going through, like many other Western countries, this process of structural transformation, moving from agriculture to manufacturing, then from manufacturing to services. A lot of that did not really have to do with China, and then specifically in the time period when China joined the WTO and leading up to it. Um, so while there were some job losses associated with rising Chinese imports in the U.S., if you look at the bigger picture, even during that time period, there was actually a lot of just sort of natural fluctuation in manufacturing employment, just even year to year. And the overall sort of workforce um, was for manufacturing had been shrinking already leading up to that. So you sort of like looking at sort of a difference on difference. Is the trend line changing? And ultimately, I argue that there are other factors too that were playing a huge role. That economists often point to, the rise of automation, the just greater attractiveness of the service economy. I mean, many people, I think now there's sort of like a nostalgia for manufacturing in the U.S. But I think we forget that it wasn't just that America lost manufacturing jobs. I think in many cases, some of the service sector jobs were just they pay better working conditions, maybe more interesting work. So for a whole host of reasons, actually, there was this shift. So yeah, I was just trying to, like not argue against the set of papers, but push back against the broader like political message that came away from this, which is that China was to blame essentially for the decline of American manufacturing, which I think is totally not correct.
I think that's the part that gets missed out often, is that when it goes into the sphere of politics, it's completely distorted the message.
Yeah, and actually, even the term shock is like a term, a technical term in economics, right? You have an exogenous shock or a large that means a large change, unexpected or external change to the model. But it doesn't necessarily mean like shock wave or in normal language. But of course, when it got put into the uh, title of that paper and then got shared in sort of media, um, then people interpret that, general public doesn't know what shock means in economics. So it felt more like, this heavy blow, this heavy impact to the American economy.
But also in a sense because that period coincided with the emergence of China's rapid rise, right?
Yeah.
From 2001 onwards. So there was really
Yeah.
an acceleration of their economic growth during that period. And from Singapore and maybe from like some of the Southeast Asian perspectives, a very crucial turning point in America's politics itself in 2001 was 9/11. And
Mhm.
and for the
Yeah.
next
Yeah.
2 to 3 years, for even up to a decade, right, there was a lot of emphasis and it reflected itself in the government spending. The military budget was increasing time and time again. So in a certain sense, the policy bandwidth wasn't necessarily focused on the rise of China or trying to solve some of the structural unemployment problems caused by the dislocation of manufacturing, but really on the fallout from 9/11. They saw that as a huge a reason as to why maybe America didn't pay attention to China's emergence during this period as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a really huge point. I mean, I remember that whole time period where so much of like the U.S. politics, political discourse was really focused on the war on terror, on the wars in the Middle East. So much of the U.S. Um, financing went to that effort, and yeah, I think you're right that the rise of China took a bit of a backseat in many ways.
It's clear that China is emerging as maybe I won't say a rival, but more like a peer competitor uh, with the US in terms of its in economic footprint on the world. We maybe it might be useful to kind of look at the turning point as well in within China's economy, and that is where I think many experts like yourself you point to the Made in China 2025 that was first promulgated about a decade ago, and the aim of it was really the shift that the government in China was trying to achieve was to go from I think what some economists call low tech, low value, and low cost into a high tech, high value, low cost paradigm where you could, you know, exploit your competitive advantage as a low cost manufacturer to build out very high quality products, especially in high tech areas. Um, there is an element of great power rivalry in it. But also there's an element of China's effort at development. I think that's often understated because if you read the kind of paper back then, there was a lot of discussion about the harmonious state. They would try to use technology as a way to escape the middle income trap because I think that was a fundamental concern that you're going to hit a local maxima and then you're not going to develop further. That was my takeaway.
Right.
That for the Made in China 2025 was really an effort to escape the middle income trap. I wanted to hear your
Yeah.
your takeaways. When you were studying this shift in China's policies, what were some of the things that you were thinking about that when you were doing those research as well?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you're right to point out that I think what makes some of China's development efforts distinctive, what separates China's approach from a lot of other developing countries, maybe countries that ended up hitting the sort of middle income trap, is that China really focused on trying to move up the value chain. And this is, you can look at it sector by sector, sort of within sector. You can look at the automotive industry. You can look at uh, pharmaceuticals. You can look at a whole host of manufacturing sectors. You can also look between sectors, right? So, China is trying to build its own aircraft manufacturing industry, its own commercial jets, for example. Um, it's now trying to, become a leader in AI and things like that. But um, but the overarching theme here is that China was not content with merely the lower value, sort of lower skilled, textile, clothing exports, consumer goods. And actually, it's very interesting. There was a recent paper that had come out looking at China versus Mexico, two countries that were, sort of moving up, very export focused, right? But the difference was that over time, China kept moving up in terms of complexity of items, in terms of like the types of goods, their technological sophistication. Whereas I think Mexico started to plateau and was exporting more of the same kinds of goods, especially to the U.S. market. So that meant that was one reason why sort of Mexico's economic growth began to sort of plateau, whereas China's kept going. And so I think this is really important. I think one thing that I try to make clear to like American audiences is that this change is like not fully reflected in like broader public views of China. I think a lot of Americans are still stuck with this idea of like China as like the exporter of like cheap goods, cheap merchandise. And and I think there's a growing realization that actually China's been moving up deliberately along the way with things like the Made in China 2025 effort. And so you can look, EVs, batteries, drones, you can look at a whole host of different sectors, subsectors, but in almost every sort of one of these key areas, you can find efforts to promote or encourage not just greater exports, but again, greater sort of technological sophistication. And that is, I think, if anything, what China is doubling down on now going forward. I think they think that this is not only a strategy that has worked well up until now, but really the only path going forward to keep moving up the technology ladder.
I think what China did was at the start really follow kind of the East Asia development playbook, where
Yes.
you try to encourage foreign direct investment, and they use that through JV. You trade market access for technology. What they
Yeah.
had as a added benefit that us smaller countries like Singapore didn't have was the size of the market. We could only at the
Right.
start offer the low cost of labor, but there was no real market to sell to. So that gave them more leverage. So at the start, there
Right.
was a lot of like a similarities in terms of its development with regards to improving its technology stack. But over time, it diverged, especially when it comes to the fact that you consider they have a huge scale. So I wanted to ask you, from your study, right? Where has the divergence start to emerge? What did China do specifically or more concretely to to really move up the value chain throughout the years?
One factor is really trying to focus on foreign partnerships, foreign technology, as you mentioned, this sort of market in exchange for technology, these joint ventures, and even when you have sort of not a joint venture, when you just have, say, a Bosch automotive parts factory, or when you have a semiconductor plant from SK Hynix or Samsung, or you have even like a Foxconn iPhone factory. Um, you know, all of these allow for sharing of not just like blueprints, like sort of formal technology, but all the manufacturing know-how, all the management techniques. For example, managing a auto supply chain is not a simple thing. And so rather than reinventing the wheel, a lot of Chinese automakers gained from the experience of having, GM, Toyota, Volkswagen all build plants in China, even, whether it was with joint ventures or later on with Tesla and the Shanghai Gigafactory. So that was really crucial. Another factor I would point out, though, that I think is less talked about is just the sheer investment in scientific research. So this has been going on for a long time. And I think you can see, on the one hand, you can see the share of manufacturing value added in China out of the sort of global manufacturing going up, but preceding that, you see an increase in the share of, say, scientific publications that are either done by Chinese researchers or done by Chinese research institutions. AI is like one classic example now where I think everyone was surprised by DeepSeek and surprised by how competitive China's AI companies are. But in reality, if you have been following, say, NeurIPS or some of the other top global AI conferences, you will have seen for a long time now, for years, very, very strong representation by researchers from Tsinghua or from even Huawei, Alibaba. They all have very strong representation. So I think that that provides the foundation then for moving up the manufacturing value chain later on. I don't think I think that's one area where you would run out of steam if you didn't have that. I think you would start to plateau with the exports of certain types of goods, maybe at the middle level, rather than being able to continue to progress to the cutting edge, to the frontier, like China has done in like solar batteries, EVs I mentioned earlier.
You were doing a study on the ecosystem of industries within China. You said that China doesn't just have a smartphone industry or a battery industry or an EV industry. It has all of these industries and more, and their strength is across multiple overlapping industries, creating a compounding effect for its industrial policies. What does that actually practically look like?
So this is really crucial because I think when we think about like industrial competitiveness and industrial policy in other countries, like in the U.S., um, we might think about policies targeting a specific industry, like building up the solar industry, for example. But I think what makes China a bit more unique, maybe it makes it look more like the some of the East Asian approaches of the past, like South Korea, um, is that China really has tried to build out and support a whole range of industries at the same time. So, like Made in China 2025, there was a whole set of target industries, some of which were like very broad based, like talking about IT equipment or robotics. Like these actually have broad applications across, large economic sectors. And so what you have now is these different sectors and subsectors start to overlap and start to support each other. So China's not just strong, like I meant, like I wrote in that piece, not just strong in smartphones or EVs or batteries, but all of those strengths end up positioning China well for related industries building on top of that. You think about, for example, the autonomous vehicle sector that's starting to grow and that Beijing has been supporting a lot. That benefits a lot from the fact that you have a large EV industry, you have very high quality and low cost sensors like LiDAR, radar, camera modules, and you have companies that are already very good at dealing with computer vision, sensor fusion, things like that. So, and you also have heavy investment in 5G technology as well. So all of that sort of builds together and gives you sort of this extra edge in other areas like autonomous vehicles. Another example is like the low altitude economy, or sort of drone delivery, and even flying taxis, right? So these sort of emerging industries build on China's existing strengths in areas like drones and again sort of like this broader infrastructure, this sort of digital infrastructure as well. So that's one area where I think it's harder, like in the West, to understand like how these all merge together. And maybe it's not always so like planned out. I don't. I think some of this is a bit can be a bit more spontaneous. But I think in the U.S. especially, we're much more used to talking about specific sectors and maybe a little bit of like subsidies or tax breaks for a certain you know part of the industry, rather than thinking more comprehensively about building an ecosystem, a whole foundation for future industries.
The end result is that you have a lot of tech companies that are Swiss Army knives, right? Where they are
Yeah,
able to evolve the kind of product offerings. And the way I think about it, just from Southeast Asia, is that they essentially now operate as a high tech conglomerate. So in the past, the
yeah.
way we think about conglomerates is that you slowly eke your way up the value chain, like a Samsung. You start maybe at some you start with maybe trading commodities, and then you eventually, with your profits, you invest and build technology. In China, you talk about the Swiss Army knives. These are companies that maybe were at first suppliers, and then they were able to move up.
One example is BYD, right? Actually started as a battery company, and it was sort of that one of the early transitions was actually from batteries to EVs, and building on its battery capabilities. Um, but then also BYD was very involved with consumer electronics, um, and so that actually also helped it later on with EVs. And then BYD has now built up its own semiconductor capabilities. Um, things like power chips, for example, and that enables things like its super fast charging, like megawatt charging capabilities. Um, so that's one example. There are other companies like Xpeng is an EV company that branched out into now robotics, or Xiaomi is probably one of the best examples now today, where they also began more smartphones, household consumer goods. I remember having lots of like small Xiaomi consumer products when I was living in Beijing, like a Xiaomi air purifier that could link up to like this other Xiaomi sensor or something like that. And and now Xiaomi has jumped into EVs. And part of that builds off of, again, its experience with, high degrees of factory automation in its other existing smartphone and consumer electronics plants. So that's, and now they also are entering into chips as well. So I think it's sort of interesting to see almost this convergence, and I've heard about this talked among uh, sort of the Chinese tech community. This sort of convergence where it used to be parallel, races, um, parallel competitions in different industries, and now they're all sort of merging into a single sort of technology arena. AI, autonomous systems, electronics, all sort of duking it out, as it were.
That's why you have the 996 culture. You have this they
Oh
call it
yeah,
involution, the 内卷. It's purely because of this dynamic. Well, not purely, but a huge part of it is because you have these areas where there is no kind of coordination between the players, where it's like, you'll take this, I'll take this part, and then like, let's not eat into each other's profit. It really is like a let's just go for it, because the market is huge, and they're competing, and the government has been very kind of open to letting them compete. And
right.
now, as they internationalize, that's a escape valve for many of them to try to escape the kind of involution that they're facing within China as well. Um, on that note, I
Yeah,
wanted to ask you a follow-on question, which was, the Xiaomi example you raised serves as an interesting parallel, because it was a consumer electronics, and that kind of model itself, and took huge inspiration from Apple. And then they went into EV
yeah,
successfully. But we now know today that, Apple also tried to go into EV, and Apple's a company that's a behemoth in the US, and across the world, but they failed at the EV venture. So my question to you, is that, if you were to kind of analyze that kind of breakdown, like, what happened? Why was it unable to, you know, build an EV that was maybe as successful as some of their Chinese competitors?
yeah. That's a really good question. Yeah, because the Apple story, I mean, they had invested. I had seen reports about like $10 billion, like a phenomenal amount of money, in trying to build out their EV program. And I think also it wasn't just EVs. I believe it was also like trying to build out maybe even a challenger to Waymo or Tesla's full self-driving in terms of having autonomous vehicles. So that makes it even more difficult. Ironically, I don't see the two as separate. I actually see that one feeds into the other. I think that one factor for Apple is seeing the rise of Chinese EVs and seeing how competitive and especially how cost competitive they are, and seeing that is, in some ways, maybe Apple made the right move. I think they got criticized for not having taken this bet, but maybe they made the right move because otherwise they would be part of this very painful, extremely cutthroat involution style global competition right now in the EV industry, right? So maybe if you're thinking about sort of shareholder returns or profitability, that it was a wise move for Apple. But they did seed a really crucial market to basically Chinese companies. I mean, you see now Tesla is having a very tough time competing and dealing with the rise of Chinese competition. On the other side of it, you do have, I think. This is sort of interesting. I mean, we can get into sort of like speculative, like even sort of cultural explanations. But one thing that has been striking to me is the willingness of Chinese companies to really jump into new industries, to make these bold bets. And in some cases, they're enticed by government incentives, government support, right? They know that the EV industry has been a priority sector for the government. But there's also this sort of like risk-taking culture that is really interesting to see. And so when you have a company jumping into semiconductors that previously had only done consumer electronics, that's quite a big bet on the future. Maybe there's also some imitation, right? Especially this idea of vertical integration is becoming bigger both within Chinese companies and then for China itself as a country, right? You have more and more parts of the supply chain being brought into the country. So there could be some parallel trends there. But that's something that yeah, that I've been trying to follow closely.
There is this 4 hour interview that is on Bilibili, which is this famous comedian in China does like Lex Freeman style podcast with the founder of XPeng. So Xiaopeng, it was like a 4 hour interview, and in it, I think there is a huge reason why they went into EV also because he detailed on that. He said that him and Lei Jun, I think they know each other, industry peers. They said that like they feel like this was a time where like China could like go to the global stage and actually prove that it could produce a very like competitive EV product, and maybe compete with the West. And it was something that hasn't that I think for many years before, like the cars were like the quintessential consumer good where you can really gauge a country's like industrial might or industrial capacity. Think with Japan, the US. So he felt like
Yeah.
this was like the chance to do it. But he said that it's extremely painful. He says this is the kind, if you want to kill your enemies, you get them to join the EV industry. That's what he said. So that's a fun aside that he made that comment.
Yeah. There's a lot there.
There is this point that you made earlier, and I wanted to revisit it, which was that when the China shock was happening, the US actually became a service powerhouse. It's the world's largest exporter of services. So, the question would then be, why not lean into that fully? Meaning, like, you definitely still have a robust manufacturing sector, but go all in to become that service provider to the world across the globe. So you continue to retain that cutting edge at the services sector, and then let China, to a certain extent, dominate areas which you think are not critical to your national interests. And then hopefully what you can do is that within your country you try to alleviate the middle income, rather than go through with all this pain and effort of industrial policies. What's the challenge with such a view that you should just stick to services?
So this is a really interesting, like, ongoing debate in the U.S. With the rise of discussions about industrial policy, with concerns about how to compete with China. Like these discussions, I think, hadn't been happening for a long time until recently in the U.S. So one thing that's interesting is sort of how and to what degree to go about this. So I think we're probably at this moment where there's sort of a resurgence of interest in bringing back manufacturing to the United States. So President Trump is obviously sort of leading the charge on a lot of that. He thinks that um, across the board, manufacturing should be brought back to the U.S. And I think that's the part of the logic behind these tariffs, or at least the rationale, that everything from automotive to down to like basic consumer goods should be, as much of that should be brought back to the U.S. as possible. It seems like, I mean, that seems like one of the rationales. So and there's a lot of pushback against that. As you point out, there's tremendous value in the service economy. U.S. service exports, whether they're professional services like financial services, legal services, whether it's education, higher education, with international students from all over the world coming to the U.S. to study at American universities. There's a whole range. Now we have sort of like tech services. So there's a very strong argument to say like, let's not try to do this return to the old days of manufacturing. Let's build on our strengths. And one stat was really striking to me. I think someone, an economist who focuses on India, actually, he had pointed out that, like, I mean, others have pointed this out too, but the market cap of NVIDIA versus the market cap of TSMC. One designs the chips, the other actually manufactures them. And yet it's the market cap of NVIDIA that's like several dozen times that of TSMC. The TSMC is not doing bad itself either. But like, could that be sort of like one data point to think about, doubling down, focusing more on that. And I kind of fall in between, where I do think that actually it's very important for economic resilience that the U.S. brings back some areas of manufacturing. So strategic industries like semiconductors, maybe batteries, automotive sector, I think is something that the U.S. just can't afford to lose completely. There's so many downstream effects of that, not just in terms of jobs, but in terms of broader industrial capabilities that you would lose. Then there's sort of like more on the border industries like steel, right? So there's a strong case to be made for national security, that you have a certain amount of steel production capacity domestically, but who needs to own it? How much government control should there be? And right now, there's a debate about the sort of so-called golden share that the U.S. government seems to have had with the Nippon Steel takeover of U.S. Steel. But then there's other industries, other sectors that I think the U.S. should not be prioritizing, because they're not the kinds of jobs that American workers want. They're not crucial to American economic or national security, and that those areas are things that we should not only be okay with, say, China producing and rely on Chinese goods, but in some ways they can really help support our own priorities. And so a classic example of that is the solar industry. I think there's a very strong case to be made, and others have made this, that right now China's lead in solar panel manufacturing, solar modules is so strong that if your concern is on climate, on quickly building out clean energy capacity, that you would do well to try to bring in more of these Chinese produced solar goods, and then you can capture all of the economic value in the installation and deployment part of it. So there's actually a lot still there in terms of job creation and economic activity related to building out solar plants, for example. But that's one area where I think we have to ask ourselves: is this something that we really, really, at what cost do we want to bring this back and make this an exclusively sort of American manufacturing capability, or to what extent are we actually trading off on other priorities here? So, for me, it's a long-winded answer to your question, but for me, it really sort of depends on specific industries and specific sectors within manufacturing. I'm not in favor of bringing it all back, but I'm also not in favor of just purely letting it all go, and just relying on services, for example.
In Singapore, there's been a consistent effort to make sure that manufacturing stays as a percentage of our GDP. It's about 20+%. So at our highest, it's about 30%. But the government has been very consistent in making sure that, especially for some of the critical goods we're producing, we have it. So even as a small country like Singapore, there is still a very logical reasoning as to why you want to ensure that you have a certain percentage of your GDP to be manufacturing capabilities as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah.
What is the aim or that you would argue that the US should pursue with regards to its industrial policy? Let me just quickly elaborate. I think in China, there's a huge emphasis on using tech as a way to kind of improve common prosperity or achieve common prosperity. So that's been the thrust, which is that, Beijing and Shanghai, you might be doing very well, but like there are tier three cities that's the whole point why we're doing this, right? So that you can create better jobs for them, their quality of life and their standard of living is improved. So they have a very developmental slant. Some might argue, that's not the full picture, but I think largely, I think by and large, there has been that thrust. So then, I guess from your perspective, right, what should be the narrative be as to, let's say we want to implement industrial policy in the US, what should kind of the ultimate objective be for the American government?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think here actually, yeah, there's some interesting questions about, you know, overall sort of national economic development, technological development on the one hand, but also sort of inequality, who gains, geographic inequality, especially, which seems to be getting worse in the U.S. So, on the one hand, I think a really core goal should be long-term productivity, which ultimately stems from improving technology, being competitive in these sort of high-value, high-tech fields. Again, whether you're talking about aerospace, or you're talking about pharmaceuticals, you're talking about um, um, even for semiconductor design and maybe even manufacturing, right? So I think that's crucial at the national level, to remain competitive and to keep pushing the boundary on that. But then there's this other question about how to share the benefits of these gains, and I think this is like a really, really big debate in the U.S. And it's very interesting to see how China is trying to go about this because for a long time, as you point out, um, Beijing has been really concerned about geographic inequality, about the rural urban divide, about trying to push some of the economic gains um, to the rest of the country and not have it just be concentrated in, say, the large cities on the coast. So you have, long-standing initiatives, and then more recent ones, like, for example, the sort of Eastern Data, Western Compute program, where they're trying to build um, data centers for traditional cloud computing, but also AI out in some of the Western provinces, some of the less developed parts of the country, also capitalizing on the fact that those parts of the country happen to also have some of the greatest renewable energy resources like solar and wind. And the idea is to build out data centers in those regions to drive economic growth there, but also to then provide broader sort of infrastructure for computing capabilities on the East Coast. So, overall, this idea is trying to combine both the goals of like broader national development, broader sort of national technology upgrading, and also this sort of regional balancing that I think is always a key concern for Beijing. I mean, they do this also with the way that they build infrastructure. In many ways, it goes against sort of like typical economic reasoning, right? It's not always in the areas that are the highest traffic or highest demand, at least today, for certain kinds of infrastructure or bridge building or railway development. But the idea is trying to rebalance some of that growth and some of those foundations for future economic growth, and trying to push that out into, say, some of the Western provinces. So that's one thing that I think will be very interesting to see in the U.S. I mean, there's a lot of geographic, location specific industrial policy efforts in the sense that you have local governments trying to, offer tax incentives for businesses to set up shop. But there's still a big question, like for AI, for example, how to ensure that it's not just Silicon Valley or Wall Street that's gaining from advances in AI, that the rest of the country will be able to be part of that, or at least not be hit so badly by potential job losses related to that, as some work gets automated.
Have you seen policy proposals coming out of the US that really looks at trying to address this geographic inequality or even opportunity inequality as you see it?
One of the biggest ones was actually with the Biden administration. So you have the Inflation Reduction Act, which really tried to spread out a lot of the renewable energy manufacturing capacity. So you have like EV plants and battery plants, in Georgia, bringing in Hyundai, or across the Midwest, or uh, um, data centers like in Tennessee and elsewhere. Texas actually turns out to be like a big solar powerhouse for a whole bunch of reasons. But yeah, the idea, and same thing with some of the semiconductor with the Chips Act. Some of the semiconductor investment was designed to not just be concentrated in one area, but to be spread out. Arizona, Ohio, New York State, um, and so I think there have been efforts, but it's always sort of like a tension, because I think naturally in some ways, due to agglomeration effects, clustering effects, you will have a tendency to still cluster around certain regions like Silicon Valley or New York. So it's sort of like trying to push against like otherwise very strong sort of economic forces, and try to create these different social outcomes.
To quote Prof. Kajutin, she talks about the China's efforts with regards to say building these so-called ghost towns at first. Is essentially you're trying to get the kids to wear oversized clothes, and then they'll eventually grow into them. So the huge reason as to why there's been such a huge infrastructure investment is really because of that. Because once you're able to build up that connectivity, then it's easier to kind of counter that agglomeration effect that you talked about earlier.
If you don't take into account potential future growth, then these things don't seem to make any sense, right? It seems like you're building infrastructure, building housing in the middle of nowhere where people don't need it. But ironically, the U.S. has the opposite problem, where we build everything too late. I mean, this is talked about a lot in Dan Wong's recent book Breakneck, where we have the problem where our building is lagging behind demand so substantially, that we have bottlenecks in the reverse direction.
US was known to be that country that really built out infrastructure. I mean, if you look at JFK Airport, when it was first built, everyone was marveled by it. Same thing with you talk about the New York subway, right? It's 24
Yeah.
hours back then when it first came out. It's an underground marvel. So a lot of us, I think, took inspiration from that. So it's not necessarily true that it was going to be the case that what you have is a lot of bottlenecks now. So I guess the question I have was like, in your view, like what's causing these bottlenecks?
This is a huge question right now in the U.S. Um, and I think a lot of it comes down to one is like misaligned incentives between sort of a few local community actors that might have veto power, that can start a kind of environmental review, or can start a protest against, say, a new housing project, or a new railway line. And some of this is actually sort of like a overcompensation for problems of the past. I think in the past, historically, the U.S. didn't protect some of these local community rights as well, and so this is like trying to give them a little bit more power, a little bit more say in this process. But unfortunately, it kind of went in the too far in the other direction, and so now projects like I'm from California, so like the California high speed rail is often cited, or even sort of like subway lines in New York, or you can point all over the country. Those, even though they would benefit a lot of people, um, who are affected along that route, or along that new highway line, for example, even though that would benefit a lot of people, it ends up being sort of constrained because a few people end up losing out. And so, there's a question about like how to, almost sort of like philosophical, like how should the gains and costs be spread out? Because maybe it's not fair if a few people take a hit, and are forced to move, and are not compensated properly for that. But at the same time, you don't want the entire economy to take a hit because a much needed transportation line is not built. So how to balance it out? How to, again, this comes back to your earlier question about how to sort of like spread out the costs and benefits of something in a more in a fair way, and also a way that honestly would have more political buy-in, right? Then you have people who maybe would not be so opposed to some of this new construction.
You've done so much work on China development and industrialization. Uh, you know, what are the right lessons in the US that should be taken out from it?
Yeah, yeah. This is a really good question because I think um, it's while the two countries obviously have such different political systems, um, I actually think that there are a lot of lessons that can be learned. One of the biggest ones is just the way that a lot of Chinese industrial policy combines both long-term sort of persistent goals, like China's effort to build up its automotive industry and then later on its EV industry. I mean, that has been going on for decades now. Same thing with semiconductors. I mean, that has been going on for multiple generations. Um, while at the same time having the kind of flexibility and adaptability to try different, experiment with different policies, different strategies. So I think where China's industrial policy has been successful, it's combined both. Like have these longer term goals that you keep sticking to, but then you have that sort of portfolio approach. You don't just get turned off by a single company not being successful. I think in the U.S., people always point to cases like Solyndra, the solar manufacturer that went under, that had some government support. And people are like, see, this is why the government should not be involved in picking winners and losers. But I think that misses the broader idea that you can support an industry. Maybe you don't have to pick winners and losers. You can provide broader support to a whole industry, and allow them to sort of more organically, create their own, winners, their own winning technologies, their own business models, right? So it doesn't have to be so top down. And then another big thing is I really think, and this will take some kind of almost psychological change in the US. But one thing I really emphasize is that China gains so much. I mentioned this earlier. China gains so much from foreign partnerships, from learning from other countries. This is really, really crucial, right? China very actively tried to bring in companies from elsewhere, send, or bring back scientists and researchers and engineers that were educated or had trained or worked in places like Germany or Japan or the U.S. And tried to capitalize on that sort of foreign knowledge and foreign learning. And I think the U.S. I think in some cases the U.S. is a very proud country, has very as a society, we've been very comfortable with this idea that, we're always the number one technology leader, when clearly that's not even true before the rise of China in areas like semiconductor manufacturing for a long time now. Um, and there was a challenge earlier with the rise of Japanese automakers back in the 1980s, where the U.S. had to look hard at itself and say, maybe we're not the best. Maybe we can actually learn. And I think here, the U.S. should try to learn from other countries, including China. Try to understand, what has made, Chinese EV makers so competitive, and not just dismiss it as, oh, they're cheaper or low quality, or the Chinese system is too different. We shouldn't bother trying to learn. I think learning from other countries is probably one of the biggest lessons.
It's interesting you point out Japan because when the Japanese were really overtaking the US in manufacturing, especially just in the vehicles. I remember reading about it, and I think the widespread political sentiment was that Japan was going to overtake the US. There was a huge effort to reduce Japanese competition, where maybe the right lesson was to kind of embrace them and try to learn as much as you can from them, because at the end of the day, the Japanese were their allies. It was
Yeah, yeah,
Japanese were very much dependent on the US security umbrella to make their
that's right.
economy viable then, right? So I think when I speak to my Chinese friends, they say, if that's how America treats its allies, then what about us when we're a coming competitor? They're definitely not gonna be gentle with us. So I think to a certain extent explains why there's been distrust, right? Both the Chinese and the US side. So that really gives me the segue into like the US China competition, which is something that we're seeing. And one area we're seeing it a lot of is in the race of AI. There's a huge AI race, and China is kind of the government. And I think you've done a report on this that's stated that is China's looking to be uh, a leading power in AI. I wanted you to comment a little bit more about what is what's your analysis of their plan so far in terms of AI industrial policy, and then maybe bring it back to the US. What is the US doing on the other side?
So for this like RAND report, one of the big takeaways from that report on China's, what we call China's industrial policy for AI, is that China was trying to apply state support across basically every layer of the tech stack. So you're thinking about from chips, data centers, overall compute capacity. You're thinking about at the model level, foundation models. Some of the research going into foundation models. You're thinking about data, and then fostering sort of startups and applications, especially sort of physical AI. We're talking about things like robotics, autonomous vehicles, autonomous systems, drones, things like that. So all this smart cities. So, across all these different layers of the tech stack, you can see, there's funding support, there's local government support, there are various sort of like industrial parks that will provide, startups with, extra support in the early days, maybe compute vouchers so that they get access to compute, which is very difficult unless, if you're like an Alibaba or a Tencent, you have your own, massive sort of data center, proprietary data centers. But if you're a smaller startup, this could be a huge bottleneck or barrier to entry. So those are some of the ways that China is trying to promote and accelerate its broader AI industry. And I think one interesting that uh, contrast with the U.S. approach that I try to point out, me and my colleagues try to point out in that report was, I think China's much more focused on AI applications, diffusion, trying to figure out how to make AI, uh, you know, turbocharge other parts of the economy. Whether you're talking about, drug discovery with AI, whether you're talking about advanced manufacturing, whether you're talking about um, maybe even government services, education, healthcare. I think they're really focused on trying to get some of the more immediate practical um, benefits from AI, as well as obviously pushing the edge on the frontier models themselves. Whereas I think for the U.S., there's this for lack of a better term, like very strong obsession with AGI and this idea of a takeoff moment when AI will be so good that it will be able to improve itself. And that this sort of super intelligence that would result will upend everything as we know it, including the economy and even the military. So, because of that focus, I think AI is seen much more in terms of sort of a national security paradigm, and that's where you get some of these things like export controls on chips to China. The fear that if the U.S. doesn't win the AI race or the race to AGI, then and China wins, that the U.S. could lose out dramatically. But I think it's sort of interesting to see because these two countries, their different views of AI really inform the different approaches to dealing with AI. So, whereas in the US, I mean, it's mostly pretty hands off, right? A lot of it is just private sector led, especially the hyperscalers and then, OpenAI, Anthropic, those sorts of companies are sort of leading the charge. And then to some extent, there's, uh, projects like Stargate, which are trying to help at least facilitate private sector build out of data centers. Um, Most of it is still sort of hands off. Whereas for China, I think there's this sense that there are levers that the government can pull at every sort of layer to help just improve broader application and use of AI.
When the DeepSeek moment came out earlier this year, I was surprised that after the moment came out in the Western media, there hasn't been any actual interest in actually how DeepSeek was integrated into a lot of consumer products within China. It was almost as if like they were interested in kind of capturing the Sputnik moment. But like after that,
Yeah.
when you start seeing some of the EVs integrate like the DeepSeek as a voice assistant, for example, things like that was completely like not of interest to like Western media, but like within China, there was a huge like hype around it where it's like, oh yeah, you get to see and use DeepSeek for so many different kind of applications.
I'm one of these people who um, is not such a strong believer in this sort of AGI takeoff moment, at least not in the not in the near term. And so because of that, I actually see China's approach as being perhaps more effective um, in terms of focusing on applications, focusing on how to really, steadily improve AI and steadily incorporate it into, various parts of, our daily lives, of business um, practices, of, education, things like that. So, I'm one of these people who I myself use AI a lot, but in sort of very simple ways, as sort of like a supercharged search, as a way to help me do some research, things like that. Um, and so I think that kind of approach, I think, will pay off. And then especially when it comes to robotics and sort of physical applications, I think about like the use of industrial AI for even just sort of like quality control and inspection. I mean, we're already starting to see a lot of that take place. And so these are areas where I think we can get some real benefits in the near to medium term, rather than having to pin our hopes on this sort of like takeoff moment. But of course, I'm always careful to hedge because you know I I I don't know if anyone knows what this whole technology will lead to. So I guess there is always a possibility that the concerns about AI safety and sort of like the long term trajectory. It could go many different ways. So I will just try to like stay as informed as possible. But I think overall, it seems like at this stage, China's approach might yield more immediate benefits.
Are there efforts within like US policy making uh, that seeks to do that? Because right now it seems that a lot of it actually is, I think a lot of the policy efforts are concerned about around the safety of AI, like the guardrails. I think a lot of policy effort is focused on that, rightly so. The competitive dynamics, so like whether it's going to be monopolized, there's also another area of concern. Within the US, I wanted to know, like, have there been a kind of a concerted effort to think like, okay, how do we actually democratize the positive effects within like say the citizenry?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there was recently that U.S. AI action plan. Um, a lot of that was focused on again trying to reduce, say, barriers to building out compute infrastructure, trying to promote the so-called American AI tech stack. This is something that like Jensen Huang of NVIDIA has talked about a lot, trying to sort of export American technology around the world and have that be the platform that other countries use for their own AI efforts. So I think there's some of that. I do think that at this stage, though, it's pretty limited in terms of trying to think about, from a policy standpoint, how to ensure some of uh, these benefits are more distributed. I do think one area that might be helpful is, and this is actually due to China, um, the American embrace of open source, or specifically open weight models, right? So after DeepSeek, DeepSeek was sort of like a takeoff point for a whole bunch of reasons. But one of those actually was the fact that it was an open source model that allowed for anyone, depending on which sort of model format you chose, but you could have different businesses basically download, serve it on their own servers, fine tune it for their own purposes. So that allowed for, I think, much greater sort of diffusion and sort of broader access to AI, to like frontier level AI. And I think now the U.S. I think even recently Sam Altman had like referenced China as being a reason for why OpenAI has now itself released an open weight model. Obviously, it's not as sophisticated as its most cutting edge proprietary frontier model, but the idea is that at least that will help provide some degree of diffusion, even if it's like a sort of less powerful model. It will provide greater sort of access to AI. I think other companies in the U.S. Seem to be following suit, and this is something that was talked about in the AI action plan for the U.S. Promotion and focus on open source in particular.
Earlier you mentioned that this point about chips exports and chips control. There are like, I think, two camps, right? One is the kind of integration camp. Like the more integrated you are with China, the more codependent you are, and therefore kind of the core mentality doesn't really apply because you no longer have a two completely siloed off economies, and because you're interdependent, there is a limit as to which you will let the rivalry or competition spiral out of control. So that's one camp. Like
Right.
I think that's like the camp that Jensen Huang like promotes. Even though if I'm selling them maybe not as good chips, the good thing is that it limits the damage or it has some form of damage control built in. The other one is like I think has been dominant as well is this idea of let's bifurcate completely, let's choke off Chinese access to critical technology, and I think you alluded into one of your essays before. Then that also creates a kind of cascading effect where both sides are trying to create harm to each other. Uh, I wanted to get your sense, like obviously the second one seems unpreferable, right? But uh, maybe you could explain, why that seems to be the mainstream like view, and also second, like what should the right response actually be?
This is a really hot topic in the U.S. What should the approach be in the area of AI competition with China? What should U.S. policy be? Um, whether the U.S. should be restricting or increasing restrictions on chip exports to China, and also for semiconductor manufacturing equipment as well. Um, and yeah, there's a bunch of questions here, because one comes down to, um, again, our discussion earlier about what you see AI turning into, whether you believe in this sort of AGI moment, and whether, like history will hinge on who can win that race to AGI first. And if that's your view, then that kind of leads naturally to this very sort of national security idea of competition between the US and China, and really trying hard to cut out China's access to chips, but also um, almost sort of like actively slow down Chinese platforms around the world. The other view is is yeah, that this is going to be a longer term competition, and that it might look more like competition in other areas, like the automotive industry, say, and EVs, where there might be different companies competing. Some are Chinese, some are American. They might be competing not just in the U.S. and China, but most, perhaps even more importantly, in third countries, all over the world, global south as well. So, how should the U.S. compete better, and just in a sort of positive some way? So yeah, I do think that a lot of this though is driven by just growing distrust between the two countries. A growing, I can tell you that in the U.S. it seems to be almost like a one-way ratcheting up of fear about China's actions, and about the challenge that China poses to, um, not just the U.S. militarily, but across the board. So I think if that continues, then I think we would just continue to see a ratcheting up of things like export controls. It seems like, for example, right now, under the second Trump administration, even though there was a rolling back of some things like the H20 chip ban, um, I think in general you see certain kinds of export controls and certain kinds of U.S. policies designed to, for lack of a better word, contain China, that were previously not considered before, and are part of this broader trend of decoupling. I think, for example, even the questioning about Chinese students and Chinese student visas in the U.S., and the consideration of policies to like prevent that or limit that, are things that I think were almost sort of like not really thinkable, a few years ago. So it gives you a sense of sort of the rising level of distrust and the rising sort of acrimony in the relationship. And yeah, unfortunately, at this point, unless there's some big deal struck, or some broader agreement, if it feels at least right now uh, as if there's sort of only a downward spiral in the relationship. So the question is like, can we at least slow down or stop that kind of downward spiral?
If you read actually about early Chinese internet history, everyone actually looked up to the US. Like it doesn't seem clear to
Yeah,
me that
yeah, yeah.
if you look at US-China relations over the past 50, 60 years, like that this was a natural like end game, right? I think
Right, right.
even if you think about like look at the wave one of internet in China, like it's all funded by American capital, right? Like to a certain extent, yes, they made money, but they provided that liquidity that the Chinese entrepreneurs didn't have, and within China they didn't have. So a lot of like technological development in China, you can say is underwritten by American capital, especially in the early years.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, one example I like to point out that we don't people don't talk about that much anymore, but the rise of Alibaba was, in part, supported by Yahoo, um, and a partnership between those 2 companies, and of course, that ended up helping Yahoo for a long time. In fact, I think that was, like, the most valuable part of Yahoo as a company for a while, was its stake in Alibaba. But, that's sort of an example of, the American VC, funding going into, Chinese tech startups, Chinese tech companies. There was a time, if it's sort of funny now to see how dramatically things have changed. But it wasn't so long ago when there was actually a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of sort of like capital, people flows going back between the two countries' tech communities. So, you know, on one hand, that sort of shows you that, it is possible. It wasn't so long ago when this was happening. But on the more cynical side, it shows you how quickly things can deteriorate. That now, U.S. VC funding to China has really, really basically all but vanished.
There is this speech that Lei Jun made in the past where he was talking about the inspiration for Xiaomi, and he said that Costco was the one of the largest inspiration for him because he was so amazed by this company that was so dedicated to value products, value consumer goods. The other two being Haidilao and Tongren. So he saw Costco
Oh
as
yeah,
the the quintessential American brand. So I think that was to showcase the kind of soft power that America had that like it
yeah,
really
yeah,
percolated uh, into like Chinese consciousness, which is
yeah,
unfortunately a bit lost now. And to revisit your point earlier, there is this essay that you wrote in the New York Times where I think it sent shockwaves, I think maybe within the US, but also within Singapore. I think some of my friends read it. And in it, obviously, it's a provocative headline. It talks about how the US might be relevant. And I wanted to really quote you here. You said, when historians look back at this administration, they pinpoint the early months of President Trump's second term as the watershed moment when China pulled away and left the United States behind. That was like the first kind of opening paragraph.
yeah, yeah.
Through what were the kind of red lights that you were seeing that you felt like, oh, this is maybe an urgent wake up call for American policymakers or American elites?
Yeah, because that piece was, on the US and China and their diverging trajectories, especially in this moment where I saw China was, like, doubling down on technology, on innovation, on trying to build up capacity for the industries of the future, whether that's, more funding support like this national, government VC fund, or whether it's, as I mentioned earlier, sort of the full stack approach to supporting AI development, right? Quantum fusion, as well as sort of traditional industries. China was really forging ahead and making a bet on the future. At the same time, I saw here in the U.S. A really disturbing picture where almost every day, I mean, it's still ongoing. Every day in the news, you see headlines about something that President Trump and the Trump administration is doing to undermine the competitiveness and the technological progress of the United States. So, I point out things like attacking American universities, which, coming back to what you were saying earlier about sort of like Chinese respect for, American brands, icons, companies. I think there's a lot of respect for American universities being among the best in the world and producing cutting edge research that then goes into, the private sector, into, the corporate sector. So undercutting American universities, undercutting public research funding like NIH, National Science Foundation support, um, and also scaring away foreign talent. So, I know that there are many researchers at Princeton who are, world class, but are now not sure what their status will be and are worried about visa situation and things like that, and see the U.S. as being suddenly a much more sort of hostile environment. Um, and of course, the huge thing is also tariffs, right? Right, which is ironic because as I mentioned earlier, part of the rationale for Trump's tariffs was to try to bring back American manufacturing. But the reality of it is the way that he's done it, that it's so across the board, so volatile and, sort of like not thought out, that it ends up undermining American manufacturing capabilities, that it makes the cost of inputs, the cost of parts, the cost of being part of global supply chains much, much higher, much more difficult for American companies to deal with. I know I've heard of examples of American companies that are considering or already starting to move production elsewhere because, why bother trying to raise your costs, pay for the tariffs and import goods into the US when you could just manufacture outside the US altogether and never have to deal with American tariffs. Um, you might not get US market access, but you get the rest of the world. And then, of course, yeah, I mean, it goes even deeper into undermining the rule of law here in the US, which is, foundational to American prosperity and its status as a global superpower. So I just saw right now in this moment, in the past few months, like such a transformation in terms of what the US is doing and compared to what China is doing, that if this continued, it could be a very bleak picture for US competitiveness going forward.
I think when President Trump was elected, there was a part of the mandate was that there is a huge divide within American society, which is you have the kind of, they say, the have or the have-nots, right? There's huge income inequality. The income inequality statistic in the US is that it's been widening like literally forever, and not just income, right?
Yeah.
Like the health outcomes, educational outcomes. The kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah. Definitely.
dissatisfaction seems something that like that really needed to be addressed. I'm not sure whether he's addressing it or whether he's been sufficiently addressed it in the past, but uh, there is a sense that there is a victimhood because for so long when America was
Right.
40% of the global GDP, was underwriting a lot of things in the world that they saw as public goods. Um, and
Right.
now there is a sense of reconfiguration globally as to like to what extent do you want to actually de-risk from the US now. So that's the funny
Yeah.
thing, because a few years back it's de-risking from China. Now
Right.
it's de-risking in the US.
Yeah. Yeah.
The follow-on question would then be, from your perspective, some of the policy proposals that, if you had, say, the ears of Secretary Bassett or Secretary Rubio, right? What would you tell them, right? If you had like 5 minutes with them, what would kind of your pitch to them be?
The first thing I would advise is stop. Stop doing what you're doing. Stop with the tariffs. Stop with the Doge destroying the U.S. federal government and firing all these workers. Stop trying to attack American universities. Stop cutting public research fundings. Uh, Stop antagonizing American allies. Um, I think that's one thing where, yeah, in the U.S., it like shows up as a headline sometimes, right? Like Canada is angry, or India is angry, or something like that. But then it fades from the American headlines, but the shockwave continues in those countries. So, like following India news, I know that it's such a huge discussion now. This almost feeling of betrayal from the United States, and that kind of sense of anger. Like Brazil also feeling like the U.S. is not just hitting it economically, but trying to meddle with its own domestic politics. Like, I think Americans don't understand how much this angers other countries. How much this, like, even though, on the surface level, diplomats, politicians might try to like play it cool and, try to manage the relationship. I think there's a lot of sort of like deep seated now animosity or resentment from these US policies by other countries. So Southeast Asia, right? Many, many countries that got hit hard with tariffs. Um, and so, yeah, my top recommendation would be first to just stop all of this, because it's been doing so much damage to American competitiveness, but also standing in the world and reputation. And then the second part would then be to, try to try to repair these ties with allies, for example, try to mend its reputations in the rest of the world. Because I think right now, like you mentioned, the world is starting to de-risk from the U.S. The U.S. is sort of like a source of instability and uncertainty, and normally we want to be a source of an anchor for stability, for sort of global security and things like that. So, to reverse this sort of negative process that is happening under this current Trump administration, I think is the most crucial policy action that we could do.
What should the US-China strategy be? Should it just be an attempt at containment suppression, or should we try to imagine something new altogether?
Yeah, I think more the latter. I think that in some ways, the U.S. should still be cautious and try to build resilience. Maybe certain areas like with rare earths, the U.S. should build its own capacity, or at least try to figure out alternative supply chains. But in other ways, I do see that it doesn't have to be such a acrimonious relationship, that it doesn't have to be this downward security spiral. Um, I think that on areas like climate, AI safety, there could still be, and there are some ongoing discussions. Maybe it's not at the highest level all the time, um, but and then there's still a lot of tremendous economic gains that could be had. Of course, there can be discussions about how to make it fair for American workers, things like that. That can be obviously an important part of the discussion. But yeah, I think that unfortunately there's a lack of creativity in Washington about how to think about both the uh, benefits and the risks to what's happening right now. So I think China's not going anywhere. I don't think that China will suddenly collapse, or that all this progress will suddenly disappear, which is what honestly some of the more extreme voices in Washington talk about. So, you know, given continuing progress in technology upgrading, industrial capacity in China, how can the U.S. make the most of that and not just have this sort of escalating negative relationship? I think it's really important, not just for the U.S.-China relationship, but for a lot of other countries that get impacted by this. I think that this is something that we really, should think about for not just a bilateral relationship, but for broader sort of global economic prosperity and stability.
My last question to you would be a question I ask every guest, which is that, if you had a piece of advice you give to a fresh graduate entering today's working world, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I mean, I would encourage, and maybe this is already more common in Singapore anyways, but I really would encourage um, someone young, someone straight out of college to spend time in another country, spend time in a different context. I tell my students at Princeton, um, like travel, go, especially since Princeton often offers funding for for travel, take advantage of that and spend time just in a different culture. There are some things that you just can't read in a book, that you can't watch in a TV show, that you have to experience firsthand. And for those people who are interested in China, like being there, even for a period of time, you can go to the big cities, you can go, out into the more rural areas, whatever it is, just being there will give you such a different perspective. So, any opportunity you have to spend time abroad, I think is really beneficial, not only for your career development, but just your own personal development.
Yeah, with that sagely advice, Carl, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. This was really great.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you are watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications for whenever new episodes are out. If you're on Spotify or Apple, it would help us greatly if you could leave a 5-star review on those platforms. Once again, thank you for tuning in to the Front Row Podcast.